GB News is being investigated by Ofcom for the second time this year. The first time it was for spreading misinformation, with Ofcom finding the channel guilty of, quote, a materially misleading interpretation of official data. That was in relation to COVID vaccines. But Ofcom is now investigating whether the channel has broken impartiality rules. According to the regulator, politicians are not allowed to be newsreaders, interviewers, or reporters in news programmes unless, quote, exceptionally, it is editorially justified. Politicians are, however, allowed to host current affairs shows. Now, that's a pretty blurry line, and Ofcom wants to get to the bottom of it. They're investigating 39 complaints about a show hosted by Esther McVey and her husband, Philip Davies. They're both Tory MPs. Now, in the show, they have been known to interview Tory MPs. The complaints have been in particular in regard to an interview with the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt. Now, the BBC report this. Whether Saturday Morning with Esther and Philip qualifies as a news or current affairs programme, and whether a broad enough range of opinions was included, is likely to be central to Ofcom's eventual ruling. Hunt appeared on the show last month to discuss his upcoming budget. It wasn't the toughest of interviews, but the questions weren't quite as easy as this.
Earlier on today, I was very fortunate to be joined by Immigration Minister, Mr. Robert Jenrick. Here's our conversation. Robert, thank you so much for coming in to speak to me about the small boats issue. The worry everybody has, put by the Prime Minister's questions today, is that lefty lawyers will stop it. How can we be sure that that won't happen?
So that was a very comradely question. That was a little bit like, you know how they have in PMQs where someone from a political party or from the Prime Minister's party, sort of asked to stand up and ask a question which gives the Prime Minister an opportunity to say what they wanted to say anyway. That looked a little bit like a planted question, but the format was not PMQs in Parliament. It was host and guest, when actually they were colleagues from the same party. And of course, we can also look forward to Lee Anderson joining the GB News fold soon. So again, difficult questions for Conservative MPs, who will have the deputy chair of the Conservative Party asking them questions. All a little bit odd. Dahlia, what do you make of this trend of Tory MPs interviewing Tory MPs? I mean, we've talked about it on other shows where you get former Labour MPs interviewing current Labour MPs, always from the centrist wing. You'll never see a Corbynite interview a Corbynite on a mainstream programme. But what do you make of this?
When I was watching this, the clips that you showed, it reminded me of something I'd seen a few days ago, where Nana Akua, who is one of the GB News presenters, was hosting this debate on whether or not Ofcom should regulate Netflix, because she was so disturbed by the lie that was told in the Meghan and Harry documentary that Britain was racist, that she was like, we need Ofcom to regulate this so that they stop lying and saying that Britain is racist, which is obviously hilarious because, karma and all the like, and, be careful what you wish for. But I mean, obviously, look, I don't need Ofcom to tell me that GB News is a deeply unserious organisation. I've said it before. GB News is constantly in this internal tussle where it really wants to be taken seriously, but the reason it exists is to be completely batshit. And so it's constantly struggling between those two things. And one way that they try to gain legitimacy is by, in their view, having, sitting MPs interviewing one another. That to them gives them an air of legitimacy. But obviously, it makes them a deeply unserious journalistic outfit. With that being said, though, I'm almost less disturbed by this kind of phenomenon of Tory MPs presenting news channels. I'm almost less disturbed by that because at least the political bias is on the table. At least it's not claiming to be respectful and serious when it's not. I feel like something that's much more insidious, or is at least as insidious, is the fact that our mainstream media outlets are stacked to the rim with people who have very strongly held political cleavings and very strongly held allegiances to particular political ideologies and even sometimes political parties. And yet, and there's a high concentration of people with the same kind of political leanings in the ranks of the media. And yet that is never scrutinized or it's never transparent. And instead they're portrayed as being, impartial and neutral even though that's not possible within the particular conditions that these media organizations are operating in. And the editorial decisions that these presenters and journalists make is very much influenced by their political networks and their ideological framework. So I'm almost like, have it all on the table, not, although obviously it is still deeply corrosive to our political culture. But I think it's important to understand that this kind of cleaving and political bias does also exist in so-called independent journalism. It's just less on the surface. It's less visible than with an outfit like GB News, which is just too clownish and too chaotic to be strategic about how it covers its tracks.
You know, I have to say, I kind of agree with you on this one. And, you know, obviously we've talked to, there's sort of two areas where Ofcom have been having a go at GB News. Now, one of them is on sort of accuracy in misleading data. And I'm really pleased, you know, we have an organization that can punish a TV show if they're, you know, putting out disinformation about COVID vaccines. You know, I would like them to also do it about climate change, for example. And I think that is a difference between the media here and the media in the US. You know, so in the US, Fox News seems to be able to say whatever it wants about COVID vaccines and it will get away with it. So I am glad there is some sort of body to say if you're sort of talking complete nonsense about public health issues, there are going to be some consequences. Great. When it comes to the sort of balance, I do think that I agree with you. Like, you know, having a Tory interview a Tory, what's the difference between having that and having, you know, a journalist who we know is completely pro-establishment in all of their biases, but don't have it on the table? And I think we saw this with Jeremy Corbyn, right? You know, the whole of the mainstream media was essentially kind of New Labour centrist, David Cameronite centrist, you know, in terms of the Conservative Party. And he was treated completely unfairly. Now, I would have preferred it if they had just put their cards on the table and said, I am a centrist journalist, and so I'm not going to deal with Jeremy Corbyn fairly. But no, they all posed as sort of really objective, professional journalists, and those biases, which were kind of just as obvious to you or I, were not out on the table. So I think this idea of that, you know, we're seeing now from sort of the liberal centrist press to sort of say, oh, GB News, this is outrageous, they're degrading journalism because you've got a conservative interviewing a conservative. We've seen centrists interview centrists for decades. And we always say this is why Keir Starmer gets an incredibly easy ride with the media, whereas Jeremy Corbyn got an incredibly difficult ride with the media, because Keir Starmer is aligned with these people. He's a pro-establishment politician, and most of the British mainstream media is pro-establishment. It's not necessarily pro-Labour or pro-Tory, it's pro-establishment. So once they speak to someone outside of that, that's when it gets pretty difficult. So I think there were some sort of justified complaints from the Brexit side, because that was outside sort of the pro-establishment bias of the media. And I think, you know, more vicious when it came to Jeremy Corbyn, because he was more challenging to establishment vested interest than Brexit ever was. They could deal with Brexit, they couldn't deal with Corbyn.